Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and in the spirit of the trees and the spirit of nature, with deep gratitude to all the generations before us who have brought us to the present place, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we continue our discussion this week about the 4th of July, about the current state of the United States of America, and in particular, today and tomorrow, to look at the Supreme Court, which over the last several years has taken a hard turn to the right with implications in the decisions that they're handing down, particularly recently with the abdication of the responsibility to preserve constitutional rights for every American citizen, 167 million citizens, all of whom are women, were denied their constitutional right over the sovereignty of their body. But there are other cases that have been handed down that are equally troubling. And so for the next 2 days, we're going to look at the US Supreme Court and seek to understand the machinations of politics and power, to look at the history that has built up to the present moment, and then to look at the implications of some of the recent cases that have been adjudicated in the spirit of right-wing nationalism and Christian fundamentalism. So that's our program over the next 2 days. Before we dive in, let's just take a moment, as we always do, to just take a breath. Become aware of your body, knowing that your body is nature. We are nature. And close your eyes if you can and center your attention on your heart. And for the next minute, to the sounds of the Ave Maria, let us commune with ourselves and with each other in a spirit of love and compassion for all sentient beings. Thank you, everyone. Before we launch in, I just want to note that many of the discussions we've been having on Humanity Rising about the crisis and challenge of democracy, about climate change, now about the Supreme Court, have been challenging for all of us. There's many reasons for deep concern about the future, indeed about the viability of the human species. And we've been very explicit as we've been talking about these matters in the spirit of ruthless realism. But we've also tried to balance that with the hope that springs eternal out of individuals in the face of extraordinary duress, who seize the day and empower themselves to do what is necessary to preserve democracy, to preserve the environment, and to ensure justice and equity to an ever-increasing number of human beings, including sentient beings in the larger ecosystem. So over the next couple of days and into next week, we're going to be reminding us of this and offering a number of courses and events that we are either sponsoring or we're co-sponsoring in some ways, one of which is a certificate on positive psychology. If you're feeling stressed and you're feeling unsure, there's a whole domain of positive psychology that we're offering with the Wellbeing Institute starting in September that will enable you, whatever you're facing, to have a bold heart and a noble spirit and a positive, optimistic outlook on whatever it is that you need to do. We have a pilgrimage to Chartres in France, where for 7 days in August, the 13th to the 19th of August, we're going to be taking now upwards of 70, 80 people, and we welcome all of you to join who can. Where for 7 days, we're going to immerse ourselves into the sanctity of the Great Mother as it's refracted through Mother Mary and the Black Madonna and the goddess Aphrodite at a time, August 15th, when the Catholic Church celebrates the Assumption of Mary into the Godhead as Mother of heaven and earth. So there are many things that we can all do as we look at the world and the mass shootings that happened on the 4th of July, and then another one yesterday, heat waves in Europe, unprecedented heat in India, the turbulence of the Ukrainian war. We want you to know that we're aware of the challenges that we're all facing, and we're doing everything we can through the university to provide you with the opportunities to build community and to fortify your internal capacity for generativity, for hope, for love, and for compassion. So I'll put some of these links in the chat box after we get going with our program. But I just wanted to articulate that commitment on our part as we go through Humanity Rising sessions day by day. So now I want to invite my very, very good and one of my oldest friends who I met back at Harvard. I believe it was in 1973 when we were studying at the Divinity School. And we've been very good friends ever since. Daniel Sheehan, who went to Harvard Law School, is the most brilliant legal mind that I personally have ever met, and who's been involved in most of the great cases, I would say, having to do with constitutional rights, having to do with human rights, starting with the Pentagon Papers and the Daniel Ellsberg case and Wounded Knee and Karen Silkwood and Iran Contra and Watergate, many of the great cases that have shaped not only American, but world culture and world morality and world perception about justice have in some way been participated in by the man that I've asked to comment over the next 2 days on the Supreme Court. So Danny, turn on your video and take yourself off mute. And I welcome you to Humanity Rising. And why don't we start, Danny, by you just summarizing anything you wanted to say about the 4th of July and the current state of affairs in the United States, and then just lead us into your own, history with the Supreme Court and your own evaluation of the current state of the Supreme Court, and then we'll have a dialogue from there. Take your time.
Terrific. Great. Thanks, Jim. Well, it's important to understand that the Supreme Court as an institution of the government of the United States here in North America is in fact a subset of a much larger culture, and that the dynamics that are going on inside the United States Supreme Court right now and in the country has been a dynamic that's been going on since the very beginning of the country, actually imported even from Europe. The fundamental dynamics of people fleeing from Europe because of the suppression of certain minority groups by the royalist forces, the aristocracy, and the elite in Europe. The whole, quote, founding of this country, setting aside for one moment, but not for long, the fact that they came to this continent and suppressed the people here, the indigenous people here, having themselves fled from Europe at the hands of the oppression of people there. So this human quality that we have as a species, which may well have been inherited from the primates from which we've evolved, is a dynamic that rests just below the surface with our human family. And that's why people coming together consciously to try to focus upon the higher angels of our human nature and to try to lift these up and strengthen these in the context of these types of moments and periods of reaction in violence is an important thing that the university and Humanity Rising have been engaged in for some time. As you mentioned at the beginning, you and I have been engaged in this for some time. I ended up going back to Harvard Divinity School after graduating from Harvard College, then Harvard Law School, and then going out into the world to practice law. And I came to discover that I had thought that I was going to be just engaging in trying to sort of retune our governmental system because it wasn't quite functioning efficiently and effectively. And I came to discover that, in fact, our government was playing an entirely different song than we had been led to believe in our high school and junior high school civics courses, et cetera. And so that I ended up going to meet with Professor John Rawls, the head of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University, to discuss this with him, my encounter with a world of courts and lawyers and government officials out in the world who were engaged in a major duplicity of trying to convey to the citizenry that they were noble and engaged in high endeavors to establish human rights and dignity, et cetera. Whereas in fact, they were all in coalition supporting a central intelligence agency and a joint special operations command of the military that were in fact suppressing people all around the world, leading torturing of people in Central America, overthrowing governments, et cetera. And so I didn't despair, but what I did is I remember I had just come back from Wounded Knee, where I was legal co-counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union in the Native American Rights Committee for ACLU National. And we were attempting to address the occupation at Wounded Knee back in 1973. And I came back after a stint there to my law office at the law office of Attorney F. Lee Bailey in Boston, at that time, probably the preeminent criminal defense law firm in the country. And I was confronted by Lee Bailey, the senior attorney there. And he said, well, wait a second, you were out at Wounded Knee. Which side were you on? He asked. And I said, well, I was trying to do as a friend of the court, as amicus to the court, trying to figure out how to resolve this thing and how to solve this thing. And he said, well, what the hell good did that do for us? You know, if you've been on the side of the FBI or the Justice Department, at least we could have earned some goodwill so that you could have gone in and potentially negotiated a sentence, for example, for like one of the Angiulo brothers here in Boston, who are the mafia, who he represented. And I started to say to myself, what am I doing in this law firm? You know, the senior partner, which has these kind of attitudes. And so I had this big debate with him Friday afternoon. And that weekend I was at church at St. Cecilia's there in Boston, where I was. And I was coming home from church. I stopped into a bookstore, as I'm sort of wont to do on a weekend when you get a little time. And I found the copy of John Rawls' new book that was called A Theory of Justice. And what he did is he undertook this masterwork at Harvard University in his capacity as the head of the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University. And he was going to explore to try to understand the basic principles of justice and elucidate these in a major postgraduate, position that he was in. But he was startled. He thought that he was going to discover that when our human family here in the United States, which is supposed to be a popular democracy, that when confronted with any given public policy problem, that we would most naturally adopt a majoritarian, utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning, pursuant to which we would try to select the given option to solve a particular problem that would generate the greatest good for the greatest number. It seemed like a perfectly logical consequence to him. But he discovered that that wasn't what was happening in the United States. That he said, as he said in the book, if we were just following rigidly the solution that generated the greatest good for the greatest number, why didn't the 90% of us who were white still own the 10% of us who were black and have them be our slaves? And he said that, well, the reason for it is because that rather than just pursue a strictly majoritarian, utilitarian mode of ethical reasoning, there's this other group of people in our culture that he referred to as the Intuitionists. And the Intuitionists are the people who say these strange things like all people are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the right to pursue their happiness. And they go on and on, making these kind of apodictic statements about the nature of our human condition. And he said that because of that, the Intuitionists in the American legal culture have had this significant impact on the pursuit of kind of raw, ruthless realism. So I was fascinated by that. And he said, he was impressed by the fact that I'd been involved in as many legal cases as I had by that time. As you mentioned, the Pentagon Papers and the Watergate burglary and other things. And so he invited me to come back to Harvard University to do a master's thesis and then a PhD thesis, comparing and contrasting these two worldviews, the worldview of majoritarian utilitarianism and intuitionism. So I came back to the university, as I said, after graduating from the college and the law school already. So I came back and I thought I was going to be in the Department of Philosophy. But it turns out that he had me assigned to the Harvard Divinity School to be studying under Ralph Potter, who was the chair of the Department of Comparative Ethics. And so that's where I'm coming from now. My whole legal practice over the past 50 years has been devoted to trying to determine how we can here in our American judicial system, in our legal system, raise up and reify these fundamental premises of the Intuitionists that there are these profound and fundamental essential rights that belong to not only human beings, but to all sentient life. And to try to figure out how to articulate that premise in a way that it can be effective in concrete in particular situations. So I just say that sort of at the beginning of our conversation here over the next 2 days, so that people understand what I perceive to be the kind of quest that that I've been involved in and others have been involved in with me over all these past 50 years. So that having been said, I want to say that the feeling that abounds today among the progressive people and the idealist people is that we seem to be in some type of a unique situation where not only are we faced with the resurgence of war in the Ukraine, in Russia, and in Eastern Europe, which we had thought idealistically we were not going to see again. We thought that we had transcended this kind of degenerate activity of people shooting missiles and hot lead at each other and trying to slaughter each other and blow up buildings and kill civilians. You know, that we thought we'd ascended in our consciousness beyond that. So we see that that's not true. That here we are here in the United States cheering on the sending of as much military hardware as we can possibly muster to send into the Ukrainians, and every night on the news being bombarded with blatant propaganda on behalf of the Ukrainian people, the poor oppressed Ukrainian people, at the hands of this horrible authoritarian terrible government of Russia, with whom we were allies in World War II, against another horrible totalitarian government. You know, and this it's almost sort of like George Orwell's 1984. You know, we keep being dragged back into these kind of ceremonies, collective national ceremonies of condemning some ultimate other and cheering on behalf of some ideal good guys on one side versus the other. And really all this really is the playing out of the dialectic of, you know, of a thesis and an antithesis, you know, good guys and bad guys, light and dark, you know, blue team versus red team, you know, but we find and we're surprised that we do that. And yet here we sit and spend huge amounts of our time watching the red team versus the blue team in football, dressed up in pads where they crash into each other and knock each other down and try to basically knock each other out if they can. Basketball, up and down the court with a ball and trying to stick it in a hoop, and red team versus blue team. New York Yankees, you know, versus the, Oakland Athletics, or, you know, in this kind of playing out of the dialectic of one team versus another team, of, you know, everything has two sides to every question. And let's engage in clashing together and seeing if we can thereby work out some sort of synthesis between the two. But basically, praising the confrontation, praising the conflict between the two sides, and carrying this out as a ceremony of some sort. There's the famous story of Margaret Mead. When she discovered back in the 50s, she discovered this primitive culture on one of the islands, I think, by New Guinea. She had discovered this tribe that existed there on this island that had been completely isolated and cut off from the whole rest of the world. And they had evolved over thousands of years, ostensibly, on this island. And so she set up an observation post on the top of one of these mountains and watched into this valley where this tribe was. And she discovered that the tribe had separated itself into two different groups. and each of them lived along the side of the valley, one on the western side, one on the eastern side of the valley, and that they would, some of their members would be hunting parties that would venture down onto the flats of the valley from the sides of the valley where they dwelled. And when any of these two hunting groups ran into each other, they would fight. And they would fight only until one person had been killed. In the instant that one person had been killed, they would stop and they would withdraw and they would return to their respective sides of the valley. And the side of the tribe that had had lost the person who'd been killed, they would engage in this intense ceremony of throwing ashes on themselves and crying and wailing and carrying out this huge funeral dirge on behalf of that person. And on the other side of the valley, the team that had vanquished that person would have this huge celebration, a gigantic fertility rite, where they'd be drinking inebriants and engaging in reckless, wanton sexual activity, like a fertility rite of some sort. And she watched this, over time until she discovered that they were taking turns. They were actually taking turns losing the person, and then swapping back and forth through this ceremony. So she became disillusioned, about sort of the basic goodness of our culture, of our human culture, that somehow we had this innate dialectical dynamic that we engage in, and so that again, I raised these points at the beginning of our conversation here to point out that this dialectic dynamic that our human beings are engaged in, or we human beings are engaged in, takes its highest kind of manifestation in the legal system, where you have the plaintiffs against the defendants, or the state against the defendant, the one party versus the other party, and they have this fundamental conflict and dialectic. And we train our young people all the way from junior high school, even earlier, elementary school, to have these debate teams, in that we actually hand out positions for them to take. Okay, here we're going to have a discussion on an important issue. The younger places, they just have, should there be capital punishment, or should there be, nuclear weapons, something like that. And that they take a card and they just assign arbitrarily one side to one team and another side to the other team. And then say, your job on each side is to make the most aggressive argument you possibly can on behalf of your position, and to try to denigrate and destroy and undermine and defeat the position of the other side. And we start training our students, our young people in our schools, right from the very beginning, to have this kind of dialectical perception of all issues. And that you get up into the junior high school and they start playing sports, and they have their football team and baseball team and basketball team in virtually every single institution of higher learning in the entire culture. And they end up hating the people right next door, the people that they play football against, or basketball, or baseball against, or soccer, or volleyball, or different kinds of sports, and to the point where the boys on one side, are vigorously fighting with the boys on the other side. Now the girls on one side are fighting with the girls on the other side in women's teams, and that they rise up. And the strange part is that the people that they're most virulently opposed to are the most like them, that actually live right in the very same area, right in the very same part of the country, right in the same state, and so that the big rivalry at the end of the year in football is between the two major teams in the state, where they all live together. So what I'm saying is that it's essential, if we're going to be having an honest and objective discussion of the flaws and the difficulties of our United States Supreme Court, at the present time, we need to understand the larger setting in which this is taking place. And what we see playing itself out now, not only at the Supreme Court, but in our entire country. We see this extraordinary confrontation going on between the, quote, two parties. You know, that somehow we've established just two political parties, good guys and bad guys, the red team and the blue team. And each one of them is doing the exact same thing. They're trying to denigrate the other side, to characterize them, to dehumanize them, and then to extol their own virtues and raise up all of their unique ideological positions, and not just to have a constructive dialogue about how they might come to some sort of common agreement on things, but how to destroy the other. And that's what's going on right now. And this has taken its purest form at the Supreme Court. That what you have is a group of people at the Supreme Court, the justices, who've all been appointed by one political party of the two. And then the other team on the Supreme Court has been appointed by the, quote, other political party. So you have, 6 Republican Party nominees now. You got Justice Roberts, Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, and Connie Bryant, all Republican appointees. And the others are all Democratic appointees. Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan, and now the most recent, Justice Brown Jackson, who has taken Justice Breyer's place. And so that we shouldn't be surprised that we see these kind of intense confrontations taking place at the Supreme Court level now. And the challenge is that now 6 of them are all on one side, and they're just dwarfing the 3 that are on the other side. The healthiest possible configuration that we could have at the Supreme Court would be to have a much deeper understanding that there aren't just 2 worldviews. There aren't just Republicans and Democrats. They're not just reactionaries and moderates in this particular case. There's an entire spectrum of human worldviews, an octave, indeed, of worldviews that range all the way from the extreme right of authoritarians to then reactionaries, then conservatives, then moderates, then liberals, then progressives, and then utopianists. These are, and then there's an 8th one, which is one yet to be fully fleshed out, which is the worldview that we're going to have to adopt once we come to realize as a human family that there are other species in the universe, in sentient, intelligent, highly technologically developed civilizations, and that we, in fact, are not at the apex of all biological evolution in the entire universe. So there's another worldview, the 8th worldview in the octave of worldviews, which is going to be the post-contact human worldview. But there's this octave of human worldviews. And so that it would be most advantageous for us, if we were going to have a Supreme Court of 9 justices, to have 8 justices, each one of whom very thoroughly reflected and had internalized the worldview of one of our acknowledged, existent, consistent, internally self-referentially consistent worldviews. And then a 9th justice, the Chief Justice, whose job it was to try to figure out how to bring these different worldviews together to resolve a particular social problem or legal problem that arose in our culture. And so that we could have this group of wise people who were honest and had complete sincerity about the worldview that they adhered to. And then we could have an intelligent, thoroughgoing discussion of their positions. And we could actually have a monitor, watch, and listen to their discussions with each other, so they could hear this debate and discussion. So each person in the country who was an adherent to one or another of these 7 now worldviews, could say, oh, okay, I hear that person. They're saying just exactly what I think. And then they could listen to the adherents to the other worldview, discussing with them what their worldview was and how they could come to some sort of collective common agreement on how we might respond to a given social problem or legal problem in these cases. That's not what we have. What we have still is sort of a primitive dialectical worldview, which is a second paradigm worldview. Out of the 8, it's the second paradigm worldview, the fundamental dialectical worldview of good guys and bad guys, of a thesis and an antithesis that clash together to ostensibly generate a synthesis, which in fact becomes its own new operating thesis and generates its own antithesis. This is the whole Hegelian dialectical dynamic of the ostensible evolution of policies in reality. So, but what I'm saying is all of this discussion we're going to have about the United States Supreme Court has to be understood in the context of this larger, more profound and fundamental problem that we have. And this is a challenge to get people, if we're going to be having a conversation about any given problem that we've got, is to have a real grasp of the more profound and underlying realities in which it's taking place. Otherwise, you're basically engaged in rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, and that's what's going on right now. For example, we have this horrible shooting, 4th of July shooting, where this young 21-year-old guy with an automatic weapon that he bought, quote, legally at a gun shop, fires recklessly into a crowd, shooting over 70 rounds into this parade, 4th of July parade, killing 6 people and seriously wounding at least 24 other people. And everybody's wringing their hands. This is absolutely awful. This is terrible. That nobody should be allowed to have one of these automatic weapons, like this. And then they always say like this. You hear the people on the news, other than in a war setting, of course. These weapons are really for the battlefield. And that we, of course, have to manufacture tens of thousands of these automatic weapons because we need to have them for the battlefield. And we, as a people, a collective people, we spend almost $800 billion every single year on military. We have 800 bases all around the world, where we're basically imposing our economic and political views on other people around the world, primarily to extract their natural resources so that we can basically be 6% of the population of the planet that consumes over 50% of all the natural resources every single calendar year, to consume material goods, and so that we wonder why inside a culture like that, we've got these problems that tend to manifest themselves, like in this particular case, this guns. In one of the cases that we're going to be talking about over the next 2 days is the case that was decided in the last week of June, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Brune, in which the United States Supreme Court struck down the New York State law that required special permits for a citizen to carry a concealed weapon. This whole debate about the right to carry weapons, the Second Amendment right to bear arms, is what is at the base of allowing 21-year-olds to purchase fully automatic weapons. These big AR weapons, automatic rifles, the AR-15 is the more well-known of these, and they can get like 70 shot clips that they can clip into this, and they can pour out 70 rounds, within like 10 seconds, which is created for the battlefield, our battlefields, the battlefields that we choose to create around the world. And so that these guns are rampant and available inside our culture. So we shouldn't be surprised that people who are demented, will get their hands on one of these weapons and seek to wreak violence on other people. And we have a culture that has, little children, 6-8-year-old children playing games, where they get points in the games for killing other people. There's actually, I guess, Grand Theft Auto. There's an electronic game where you get points for raping women in a park, or stealing people's cars and hijacking their cars and killing them. And they have these games which are part of the market system that's been generated by the electronic game industry. And these are rampant inside the culture. Now, what I'm saying here is that in order to discuss what's going on at the United States Supreme Court right now, we have to keep in mind that this is, in fact, a symptom of much more profound problems inside our American culture and in general inside our human culture. And so the argument is, resultingly, that what really needs to happen is we need to be concentrating on elevating the consciousness of all of our human family. We have to do it here inside our country, which, we are the Rome of our era. We are the ones foisting, Pax Americana on the rest of the world. We are the great military bully of the 21st and 20th century, at least the 21st century, and so that we have to come to grips with these profound fundamental problems that unless our consciousness is elevated, and we'll discuss what that means, what the metrics are by means of which you measure a phenomenon like that. But we have to raise the consciousness of our people, or else they're going to be blindly attached to one or another of these disparate worldviews, this octave of human worldviews, and be completely convinced that that one worldview is completely correct, because there is designed inside each of those worldviews a completely internally self-referentially consistent position that they're taking, that as long as you're not influenced by people outside of your worldview, this looks like it's completely real. And that's what's going on here. So that in order to ascend above and beyond a particular worldview into which you happen to have been born, or your social culture that you're born into, inculcates this worldview in you, but the only way to transcend that type of programming is, in fact, to raise your consciousness and to assist others in raising their consciousness. And that's why we're having this discussion, through the Ubiquity University and Humanity Rising, because this is a fundamental thesis that we share inside our community that is the fundamental solution to this problem. And so that when we discuss the dynamics that are going on inside the United States Supreme Court right now, I want all of us to keep that in mind, that we're not engaged in an isolated discussion of what's wrong with the United States Supreme Court right now, as distinguished from what's wrong in our culture, what's wrong not only in our North American culture, but what's wrong in our human culture at the present time. And so that I just want to have that caveat at the beginning of this discussion. And that's all introductory to the discussion we're going to be having, which is really discussing this week that was the final week of June of 2022, in which a whole myriad of cases were decided by the United States Supreme Court and have been written by this majority, this 6-person or 5-person, depending upon the decision, 6-person or 5-person majority made up of these hardcore right-wing reactionary members of the Supreme Court: Justice Roberts, Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, and Justice Connie Bryant. These are the ones that are making these decisions. And the other justices, Sotomayor and Kagan and Justice Breyer, before he just retired, all being in the minority and getting kind of steamrolled by this 6-person or 5-person majority. That's the dynamic that's going on. In the 3 cases that you hear talked about virtually all the time on NPR or MSNBC or CNN, which 90 or even PBS, 90% of all of us listen to those stations to get our news. And what you hear them talking about is these 3 horrible cases that were decided last week. Well, the fact is there were 4. There's another case that was decided that we'll talk about. That is the case of the state of Oklahoma versus Castro, Huerta. And this is a United States Supreme Court case that was decided that same week that was, where the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association gun rights, where they struck down the New York statute that required a permit to carry a concealed weapon. And then there's West Virginia versus the EPA, which has been touted by people in the progressive community as the gutting of the Environmental Protection Act, thereby destroying the ability of our government to effectively address global climate change. And there, of course, is the Dobbs case, Dobbs versus the Jackson Women's Health Organization, which struck down and reversed Roe versus Wade, which has gotten probably 75% of all of the ink and airtime over this past few weeks. And so that what we can do is we can discuss the individual cases and what their implications are. But I want us to keep in mind that the discussion that we're going to be having about these particular cases and the dialectic that's going on between the 2 sides of the court is not going to provide any great insight or solution in and of itself, any more than a discussion of the conflict between the Republican and Democratic Party, or the discussion of the January 6th events in the hearings that are being held in the Congress right now, or the upcoming election in 2022 in November, where what is at stake is whether the red team or the blue team is going to take control of the legislative body of the country, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, much less the upcoming presidential election in 2024, where the huge discussion is, is Donald Trump possibly going to be the Republican Party nominee and actually get their nomination and run for the presidency? And the other side of it is, oh, woe is me. What are we going to do on behalf of the Democratic Party to stave off that possibility, given the fact that the president that the Democrats have held up is now 80 years old or more, and is kind of toddling around, and all these discussions going on the front page of the New York Times. Oh, is President Biden up for another term, or is he too old? And what are we going to do about the fact that the vice president, Kamala Harris, isn't really liked by that many people, that she's probably not a very strong candidate to run against Donald Trump? And so let's really beat up on Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, to make him indict Donald Trump and get him convicted of seditious conspiracy, because that's one of the few statutes that will disqualify him from running for president. And so let's totally politicize the Justice Department by having them indict this guy for anything they can think of, whether it's tax fraud, sedition, lying, perjury, whatever, jaywalking, if you can get him convicted of something so that he can't run. Why? Because he might win. And so we've got that this set of problems facing us right now. And what I want to do, what Jim and I want to do over the period of the next couple of days, is try to unpack these problems so that we can get a sense of how we can actually approach this in addition to the fundamental need to elevate the consciousness of the individual human beings who make up our citizenry. And what might that process look like? How might we address the education system that we have to include meditation, diet, understanding of diet and its effect upon your consciousness, different types of physical disciplines, taking care of your body, understand the relationship it has to your consciousness, etc. These are all things that we're going to have to consider, but we're going to, for the moment, put them on a shelf to realize that until such time as you discuss these things and try to address the solution that's implied by our having to do this thing, you're not going to solve these other problems. You're going to be basically dancing around talking about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Okay, so just I want us all to know that. Now, I happen to have studied constitutional law under Lawrence Tribe, and a lot of you now have seen Larry Tribe appear because he was the constitutional law professor for Barack Obama. He was the constitutional law professor for Merrick Garland. He was the law professor for several of the justices on the Supreme Court who went to Harvard Law School. I was in his very first class that he ever taught at Harvard Law School. And so I've known Larry Tribe for a long time. And so I will say this to start off our conversation. He has stated that he personally is convinced, because of his personal knowledge of Merrick Garland, that Merrick Garland is in fact going to indict Donald Trump for seditious conspiracy. But it's important to understand that he has to not only get him indicted, but he's got to get him convicted of it in order to disqualify Trump from running for the presidency in 2024. The simple indictment isn't going to stop him. He's got to be convicted of it to disqualify him from running for the presidency. Now, I've already pointed out that I find this tactic to be extremely troubling, to have so many of the population just pouring political pressure on Merrick Garland to indict him and get him convicted. Hurry up and get this done. Whereas what Lawrence Tribe is saying is that he knows Merrick Garland, who's extraordinarily cautious and very careful, and therefore he's being very careful about building the case that is going to be lodged against Donald Trump. This is with full knowledge that the precedent that this is going to be setting of having a Justice Department, the Attorney General for which has been appointed politically by one of the political parties, indict and prosecute and try to convict the president from the other party to disqualify him from running for office again, because so many people in the Attorney General's political party are afraid that that former president would win. We've got to keep that in mind as an extraordinarily serious concern. And to keep it topical, what about the appeal that's going to be taken from that? Just going to end up in front of the United States Supreme Court, where 6 of the justices, this controlling majority, have all been appointed by the political party of Donald Trump, 3 of whom were personally appointed by Donald Trump. This is not going to be an easy equation as to how this indictment and prosecution has to be conducted. And one final point on this, the irony of it all, is that Merrick Garland, who is the Attorney General of the United States, who's going to be making this decision, which is going to be subject to the review by the Supreme Court, is in fact the person who had been nominated by President Biden to be on the United States Supreme Court, and was denied a hearing was part of the whole process of trying to get him nominated for the United States Supreme Court by Obama, rather. And the reason that he was nominated was because they knew that McConnell, the majority leader of the United States Senate, and the head of the Judiciary Committee of the Republican Party under Obama, the Republican Senate, would refuse to give him a hearing. They chose the most moderate person, the Obama administration chose the most moderate person they could conceivably think of to nominate for the Supreme Court, because they knew that he wasn't going to be given a hearing. And so they wanted to be able to flaunt the fact that the Republicans were blocking any hearing on him, even though he was the most moderate person you could think of. And then when he was denied a hearing and they held off nominating or voting on him, and then put Kavanaugh in, or Gorsuch actually, at that point, in his place, the Democratic Party had the temerity to appoint him to be the Attorney General of the United States. And so now they're saddled with the fact that they got the most moderate possible Attorney General now sitting in that seat, who they're all now carping about being too slow and too moderate and too careful about his evaluation of the charges against Donald Trump. So all of these issues are going to be eventually presented to this United States Supreme Court. And we know that what's going on here is that at least 5 of these justices, that's Connie Bryant, Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, are just rigidly hardcore right-wing second paradigm dialecticians and reactionaries, okay? And we can discuss what their kind of judicial point of view is, but Justice Roberts is the Chief Justice who's trying to figure out how to try to salvage any type of reputation of the Supreme Court as an objective, honest body of deliberation, because he knows that what's happening now is the United States Supreme Court has fallen to the lowest level of esteem on the part of the American population in the entire history of the Supreme Court. Only 24% of the people polled recently have any confidence in the honesty and the objective nature of the Supreme Court. And so Justice Roberts has been struggling to try to figure out how he can join with the minority, Sotomayor and Kagan and previously Justice Bryant, to salvage some sort of an objective opinion out of the Supreme Court. But the problem is now he's overwhelmed. Even if he joins the 3 justices, it's only 4 judges, and the other 5 are going to run rampant right over them. And so this is a problem that Roberts has right now. So these dynamics of what are going on at the Supreme Court level are extraordinarily important as a window into what's going on in our country. But as I've said before, the 99.9% of every discussion you ever hear about all of this is functioning in a way of being oblivious to the more profound and fundamental underlying problems that are in our culture that are being reflected at the Supreme Court. Okay, so I just want us to understand that having this conversation about the court as such is important, but the reality is that this is reflective of more profound problems in our culture that have in fact existed right from the very inception of our country. In the founding of the Constitution itself, there were these 2 basic groups. There are the Hamiltonians, Alexander Hamilton, who was a lawyer, who's much different than the Broadway character that you've heard about. I mean, Alexander Hamilton, well, a very impressive person, was a lawyer and was the lawyer for the mercantilists, for the merchant class and the financial institutions that existed in the colonies. And they were all very much in favor of maintaining an aristocratic elite governing power within a polity. They were very much like the Europeans that they had fled to get out from under the domination of. but they believed in a tiny minority of people making the decisions for the collective community. And that they instilled those principles into the Constitution of the United States. As you remember, or not, the fact is that at the beginning, at that point in time, at the creation of the Constitution in 1789, the first 3 articles, that the only people that could vote were white, male, adult property owners, real property owners. Okay, that was because those were the rules in state legislatures. Okay, and that the state legislatures were designated as the one to make the decision to who could vote, right? And also that the people could not even vote for the president. All they could vote for was a group of electors that would in fact tell the legislature who they thought should be elected. And then the state legislatures had the complete authority to either take their advice or disregard them. So the state legislatures were the ones that were in charge of making decisions. And in fact, you couldn't even vote for your own United States senator. The same thing occurred there. It was the state legislature that chose the senator for your state. So that these things are important to remember, that the Hamiltonians had a major impact upon the structure of the original Constitution, where women couldn't vote, Black people couldn't vote, Native American people couldn't vote, non-property owners couldn't vote, non-white people couldn't vote, and so what's happening is that this 6-person majority, or at least let's call it the 5-person majority to give Justice Roberts the benefit of some doubt, that there's these 5 of them, they want to get everything back right to the way it was when the Constitution was actually formed. They want to take a look at the intention of the founders of the Constitution, and they want to go back to that as a referent for what rights are going to be recognized, who can vote, etc., and who's in charge of deciding who can vote. Now, on the other hand, there was this other group at the founding of the Constitution. They're referred to as the Jeffersonians. They're actually the Madisonians. It was James Madison that was actually the leader of that other group, the Intuitionists, if you will. And it turns out that Madison and Aaron Burr and others of that were all trained at a particular school, the College of New Jersey, later to become Princeton University. They were all students of John Witherspoon, Professor John Witherspoon, who taught moral philosophy at the College of New Jersey. And he taught this whole thing of about basic fundamental Judeo-Christian social ethics that he taught. And he taught people that there were, I've got the numbers here actually, which I keep with me, that 37 of the original federal judges were all students of John Witherspoon. 3 of the original United States Supreme Court justices, 10 cabinet officers, 21 of the United States senators, 39 of the US congressmen, all at the beginning were all students of John Witherspoon at the College of New Jersey, all Madisonians. And that's why the Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1791, all of it reflects the kind of intuitionist natural law philosophy of the fundamental rights that human beings have by nature of our own humanity. Okay, that these are the principles that were inculcated into the Constitution with all of its amendments. So you have right at the very beginning of our Constitution this tension, this dialectical dynamic going on between these 2 different worldviews. And so this has been enshrined in the Constitution, this type of dynamic that is going on. So the struggle has been going on between the elitists, the mercantilists, the financial institutions and their lawyers that on the one side, and the more rural agrarian Intuitionists, and Madisonians on the other side. And so that that this has been structured into the United States Constitution. And there's one other point I want to make that is important for us all to know. There's been this discussion that you've heard going on about the Electoral College. Oh, we got to get rid of the Electoral College. The fact of the matter is that the Electoral College is reflective of a principle that was absolutely essential to have resolved, or else there never would have been any United States government under the Constitution. And that was that every single one of the original colonies, the original 13 colonies, which were then the states inside the United States, had to have 2 United States senators in the Senate, even though the member of their House of Representatives, the number of them was determined by their population. So the colonies that had a greater population had more members in the House of Representatives based on population, but they still had 2 senators. So you had a little place like Rhode Island had 2 senators. And on the other hand, New York or the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they had tons more population, had only 2 senators. And so what the problem is that we have right now, and it's one of those fundamental, profound problems that we're dealing with, is that in the United States right now, that 27 of our states select 52 of our United States senators, okay? And so they control the Senate with 52 votes out of the 100, right? So there's only 27 states that choose the 52 senators. And those 27 states contain only 18% of the population of our entire United States. And so the 18% of the population control the United States Senate. And the United States Senate is required to approve any piece of legislation. So no matter what the House of Representatives does, as with regard to passing legislation based upon the popular vote in the population of the country, if they can't get it past the United States Senate, it will not become law. And so you see now with Manchin from West Virginia and Sinema from Arizona, they're blocking, the 2 senators are blocking anything from being able to be passed that the House of Representatives and the majority of the Democratic Party and the majority of the people in the country want passed. So you have all kinds of policies that a vast majority of people in the country want that aren't being implemented because this 18% of the population of the country can block them with the United States Senate. So all of these problems, and it sounds like, that I'm rolling out one problem after another, but what I'm saying is all of these have one fundamental thing in common, and that is that these problems are a function of the lack of higher consciousness on the part of our people, okay? And so that we're not going to be able to solve these problems in any kind of profound or fundamental way unless and until we focus on consciously undertaking a program in the United States to raise the consciousness of our people. And one of the problems is that this issue of raising our consciousness is conflated with the issue of religion. And in the Constitution, in the First Amendment of the Constitution, it says that Congress shall pass no law abridging the right of freedom of religion. And so therefore, it's perceived that you cannot utilize the instrumentalities of government, either federal with regard to the First Amendment or in the states pursuant to the 14th Amendment, that you cannot utilize the instrumentalities of the federal or state government to try to instill higher consciousness in the people, because that will be perceived as transgressing the prohibition against the federal government and state government from being involved in religion and trying to establish some sort of state religion. And so this has to be undertaken by the private population. So things like Ubiquity University, things like the religious traditions, et cetera, that we have the responsibility for raising the consciousness of the people. And one of the challenges that is very true, and that is that the major existent institutional religions, from the Catholic Church to the Protestant denominations to the even the Unitarians and the Jewish traditions and Muslim traditions, et cetera, the institutionalized religions are locked down on a set of premises and beliefs that are not necessarily designed to generate an elevation of the consciousness of their members, that they're more inclined to empower the institutional members of the church to make policies. And the minute you try to cross over into doing something to actually generate a higher and higher consciousness on the part of the members of the church organizations, that's viewed as blasphemy of some sort, because it's actually undermining the authority of the persons in charge of the institutions of that religion. And so what's happened is that this raising of the consciousness of our people has been relegated to private organizations that are not official churches, that don't have a kind of a hierarchy in charge of them. And it's tended to be referred to as, quote, the New Age movement. The New Age movement, which is fixated with the issue of consciousness, of elevating consciousness, increasing consciousness, reaching down into all of the different major religious traditions to the point in history where they were actually, prior to their institutionalization, devoted to the task of raising people's consciousness. And so that you find this peculiar dynamic going on now, even at Ubiquity University and other places, of reaching past and through the institutional religious communities down into their history, where they, prior to their becoming rigidly institutionalized, were actually devoted to trying to instigate higher consciousness in people. And so this process that is going on is one that, what I'm suggesting here is that this is the potential salvation dynamic. It is in the effort that's being made now by people who are devoted to raising our consciousness, to reforming the institutional churches, is a praiseworthy undertaking. It's a challenge because of the ossification of the institutional structures inside the religious organizations. But it is still a worthwhile task, because you get such an advantage if you can actually impact the institutional structures of these religious organizations, because you get an incredible multiplier effect of being able to have the institutions engage in a greater effort to elevate the consciousness of their people. But on the other hand, if you want to have a straight undertaking of activity to raise the consciousness of people, you have to really focus outside of those institutions at the present time. And that's what Ubiquity University and others are engaged in. Our Romero Institute, I'm a co-founder of our Romero Institute. Jim was one of the co-founders of our Christic Institute, which is the parent organization for our present Romero Institute. We founded the Christic Institute back in Washington, D.C. back in 1980. When Jim and I were working at the Jesuit National Headquarters, Jim working on the issue of nuclear weapons, to abolish nuclear weapons, and I was general counsel in the social ministry office. So we have spent our time working inside institutions of the churches, Protestant, Catholic primarily, and Jewish traditions. But we realized that there needs to be a major effort mounted within our, might we say, civilian population, non-government, non-religious institution portion of our society, to actually increase the consciousness of our people. And if we can do that, we will start to make some progress on how to address this thing. and it will deal with different problems, including the issue of how to deal with the United States Supreme Court. And we would try to get people appointed to the United States Supreme Court who are people of higher consciousness, not people who are, blind adherents to one of these two worldviews, of a moderate worldview, which is, they keep referring to the liberal side of the court with Sotomayor and Kagan and Breyer, but that's not true. They're very moderate people. They're part of the moderate worldview, which is a fourth paradigm worldview in the octave of worldviews. These other people, including Roberts, are reactionaries. They're second paradigm dialecticians. And that's what they are. And so these people are locked in to those two worldviews and are, by their very nature, are being dragged into a dialectic. And so that you can see these opinions, every one of these opinions that was handed down, the Dobbs versus the Jackson Women's Health Organization, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association case, the EPA case, and the one we'll talk about tomorrow, the Oklahoma versus the Castro Huerta case dealing with Native American sovereignty. All of these decisions have aggressive dissents that are written by, quote, the other side. And so that you get the expostulation on the part of the majority, whether it's written by Justice Roberts or Justice Kavanaugh or Justice Gorsuch or Justice Thomas or Justice Alito, actually. Connie Bryant hasn't written any of these opinions. But they espouse a very aggressive, very well articulated, and very well reasoned, for the most part, decision. And the other judges, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Breyer now, would just light into them with this alternative vision that would generate a completely different conclusion. And so people out among the laity in the civilian population are kind of perplexed and confused and troubled by this dynamic that's going on inside the Supreme Court. Just like the average person is very troubled by this weird conflict that's going on between the Republican and Democrats right now in the country. And so that what we want to do here in the next couple of days is to discuss these opinions, the particular opinions that deal with specific issues such as women's rights, the environmental protection of the Environmental Protection Agency, the issue of gun rights, and we'll talk about the issue of the sovereignty of the Native American tribes when we discuss Oklahoma versus Castro, and we'll start to shed some light on one of the first cases is going to be taken up in the October term when these same justices, now with Brown Jackson taking Breyer's place, taking her seat on the court, Brachine versus Holland. It's another. This is a case where the American Association of Adoption Attorneys and the Federalist Society and a group called the Goldwater Institute have launched an attack on the Indian Child Welfare Act, which act mandates that Native American children, if they're taken from their parents by a state Department of Social Services, have to be placed within their tribe with relatives in the tribe or other tribal members. And the American Academy of Adoption Attorneys and the Federal Society have attacked that, saying that it's racially discriminatory against white people. This is one of those reverse discrimination cases, where they attack affirmative action and all that. So this is they're laying this one up for the court to declare the Indian Child Welfare Act to be a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, since it's racially discriminatory against white people who want to adopt an Indian child. And they don't want the Indian child to be left with their Native American relatives so they can stay within their culture, which is the entire import of the Indian Child Welfare Act that was passed back in 1978 after the Wounded Knee occupation and upheaval with the Native people. So we'll be talking about these cases over the next couple days and getting into some of the details. But as I said, I want to have you keep in mind the fact that while we can be extremely articulate and very detailed about each one of these cases and the issue that's at stake, whether it's gun rights or the right to protect our climate or women's rights or sovereignty of native tribes, the fact of the matter is that there's going to be no solution found inside those discussions that have gone on at the Supreme Court, because the only solution to these problems is going to be the elevation of the consciousness of our people, and to then implement into the legislation of our country through the legislative process and executive branch process a much higher elevated consciousness than is presently existent. And so just in closing on this point, I would say that, because we won't be re-plowing this particular fundamental issue that I raised here tomorrow. The bottom line is that the question of what the metric is by means of which one can evaluate the level of consciousness of another person is an extraordinarily important issue, because if in fact we're going to be, even in the private sector, engaged in a more radical and profound endeavor than just debating the positions in the Supreme Court or the positions taken between the two political parties. If we're going to be engaged in a process of trying to actively and self-consciously raise the consciousness of people, we're going to have to understand what we're doing here. Go drink of water here. Okay. So this is probably a discussion for another time to address this profoundly important issue directly of how do we go about raising the consciousness of people? What is the metric by means of which we're going to be able to decide whether there's higher consciousness or not? And so we'll have a separate discussion about that. But the bottom line is that this issue that, as I pointed out, has been perceived to be the exclusive realm of the religious communities is one that has been so poorly attended to by most of the institutional religions that our generations have felt compelled to undertake this process ourselves, which in the final analysis is probably a much safer way to go about it, but it's not as immediately effective as might be undertaken if you had a large set of institutions that were involved in teaching young people and having services every week, where you can have conversations with people about this issue. So that's where we are right now. So we'll relegate that discussion to another time, but be notified that it has to do with our own physical bodies, and it has to do with our own energy fields in our bodies, and that there are ancient secrets that are known. They're open secrets about this process of addressing and heightening the vibrational frequency of the energy systems of our human body that put us into a linkage with the unitive phenomenon that abides in the universe, that makes us experience the unity of all being. And we operate from that level of consciousness in making our decisions. And Jimmy and I have spent a lot of time talking about this particular one, but we'll talk about that in another time. But we'll deal with the decisions of these courts, this court actually, when we gather again tomorrow.
Thank you, Danny. So powerful presentation of the context of the Supreme Court. And the essential point, I think, everyone, is that what's going on in the Supreme Court now not only has a long history going back to origins of the country, but is a symptom of the paralysis emanating out of a worldview that's caught up in dialectical materialism, essentially, of a thesis and an antithesis, the blue team against the red team. And as long as we're in that complexio, we can't expect different outcomes. So Danny is making, I think, the seminal point that the only way out of the present predicament, well beyond what happens in November 2024, is what we can do to elevate consciousness in this country and around the world, so that we can fashion the instrumentalities of governance from a different, higher perspective that's more inclusive, ultimately, in an awareness that we are not alone in this vast universe, nor are we at the apex of the sentient pyramid. Danny, did I encapsulate the essential message here?
Yeah, that's the bottom line. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bottom line.
Yeah. So,
but our Romero Institute, the Romero Institute that Sarah has, flogged me to say, making sure everybody knows, what we're doing, that people might guess that I'm part of the Ubiquity University. We're actually, the Romero Institute is the progeny of the Christic Institute that Jim and I and Sarah and Father Bill Davis and others founded back in 1980. But the Romero Institute is engaged in different projects, individual projects, where we've drafted the 350-page bill for combating global climate change in California. We've tried to get it passed the legislature. We represent the indigenous people of the Lakota tribes and have been fighting the major pipelines that are going on there. We're actually drafting a major federal criminal racketeering criminal indictment against the 6 major oil corporations in the state of California for lying to the people for all these decades about the fact that they've known that they've been destroying the climate with their fossil fuels. That we do these particular individual projects, but we're more generally devoted to this very task that Jim and I are talking about here, of figuring out how we raise the consciousness of our people in the context of individual challenges like this. That's the whole idea, that you have to have this praxis of the relationship between the elevation of consciousness and the solving of particular concrete problems. That's the key that we're all involved in here. And that Jim's organization with Ubiquity University discusses this in some detail. Our Romero Institute is sort of on the ground dealing with the individual confrontations and trying to deal with these things in specific concrete contexts. But that's the kind of partnership that we all have here. But you can contact us at the romeroinstitute.org. It's very simple, romeroinstitute.org. And you can find the different projects we're working on, but we're now engaged in a very conscious program of discussing these very issues for all the reasons we pointed out, is that it doesn't do any good to just keep talking about these problems if you don't understand what the larger context is that is generating these particular problems. So that's why we're having these conversations over the next couple of days here about the court.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, everyone. That brings us to a close for today. We'll continue tomorrow with Danny talking about the specifics of the Supreme Court cases. And I would add, Danny, I think another point of the agenda tomorrow, I think people would love to hear your analysis of the January 6th insurrection. I think that would be a wonderful thing to maybe start with, because it's all part of the same complex social-political reality here in the United States. So that'll be tomorrow, everyone, on the Supreme Court with Dan Sheehan, constitutional litigator. I recommend the Romero Institute .org. The Romero Institute is on the cutting edge. They're on the front line where Danny's been his whole life, and I support them completely and recommend you go on their website, contribute to their cause. They're doing extraordinarily important work in the revitalization of the ecology and the democracy here in the United States. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link just put in by Stan if you want to join the discussion. And we'll see everyone tomorrow, same time, same station. Danny, thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been brilliant, brother. See you tomorrow. All right.
See you
Bye,
tomorrow.
everyone.
Great
Bye-bye.
game.